In today's video, we examine a game where a leading figure of hypermodernism, Richard Reti, introduces his revolutionary opening idea. This opening, later named after Reti, was called the Opening of the Future by Savielly Tartakower, as it challenges the classical principles of opening play and sets the stage for a new era of chess strategy. So let's dive into this strategic masterpiece. The idea of the Reti opening is a very sophisticated one. Instead of immediately occupying the center with one of his pawns, Reti plays knight f3, inducing his opponent to occupy the center with his pawns, after which Reti is going to fianchetto both of his bishops and put pressure on black's center. And only later in the game, when the right time comes, he is going to push his central pawns forward. His opponent, one of the greatest representatives of the classical school of chess, Akiba Rubinstein, immediately occupies the center with his pawn, d5. g3, preparing the fianchetto of the bishop, knight f6, bishop g2, and Rubinstein decides to fianchetto his bishop too, in order to put pressure on white's center and the queen side. And Reti immediately attacks black's central pawn by playing c4. Now black has different options. He can reinforce his central pawn by playing c6, or he can capture on c4, but white in this case gets the pawn back right away by playing queen a4 check, followed by queen takes c4, or as Rubinstein did in our actual game, he plays in line with the classical principles of chess. He crosses the center of the board, getting the space advantage and restricting white's position. However, as the game will show, the d4 pawn is not sufficiently protected. Reti plays d3, and after bishop g7, now it's time to fianchetto the second bishop, and usually in the Reti opening white plays b3 followed by bishop b2. But in our game, as black has already pushed his pawn to d4, and this pawn is the pride of black's position and it restricts white, and black must reinforce this pawn. And the most natural way of doing that is, of course, by playing c5. And in the anticipation of c5, instead of playing b3, Reti plays b4. He will still fianchetto his bishop, but on b4 his pawn is better placed than on b3 because it controls the c5 square. Rubinstein castles and knight d2. Now Reti's idea is clear. The d4 pawn is already attacked once, he's going to attack it for the second time with the knight and for the third time with the bishop, after which the pawn will be doomed. Rubinstein still plays c5. Of course, Reti could have captured on c5 right away, but in this case, black would have got the pawn back by playing knight d7. Targeting the pawn, and knight b3 doesn't really defend the pawn because black can still capture it, and after knight takes c5, queen a5 check, black gets the piece back. So instead of, after black played c5, instead of capturing on c5, Reti plays knight b3, increasing the pressure on c5, threatening to capture it, and as black cannot retain his pawn chain by playing b6, which would terribly weaken the long diagonal, after which black would simply lose his rook on a8. So as black cannot play b6, he must capture on b4, temporarily winning a pawn, but of course now his d4 pawn is doomed. So actually Reti managed to exchange his b pawn for black's central pawn, which of course is in white's favor. So Reti plays bishop b2, attacking the d4 pawn for the third time, and after knight takes c6, he finally captures this pawn. Knight takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4. So the material balance is re-established, but now white has a pawn majority in the center. He has three very strong pawns, which have a great potential, while black only has one pawn in the center. But black in his turn, of course, has a pawn majority on the queen side, 3 pawns against 1 pawn. And black has an opportunity to create a passed pawn on the queen side. So, white's light-squared bishop puts a very unpleasant pressure on the long diagonal. The b7 pawn is under constant attack, so Rubinstein plays b6. He's going to fianchetto his bishop in order to challenge white's great bishop. Of course, temporarily the diagonal is weak, the rook is unguarded, but white cannot exploit that. If he plays knight d2, for example, attacking the rook, then the knight on f3 was defending the bishop, and now the bishop would be unguarded, so black can sacrifice the exchange by capturing on d4, and after bishop takes a8, black has a strong move, knight g4, with the double attack, attacking both the rook and the f2 pawn, threatening checkmate actually. So after b6, of course, Reti didn't make this mistake, he didn't play knight d2, instead he made a much stronger move. He plays a3, after which both the A and the B files will open and white major pieces will put a lot of pressure on black's queenside pawns. So Rubinstein of course plays bishop b7, creating an immediate threat of bishop takes f3, eliminating the knight, which is defending the bishop. So after bishop takes f3, black can capture the unguarded d4 bishop, so Reti retreats the bishop to b2, and now white is threatening to capture on b4, winning a pawn, so black must capture, after which both the A and B file open and the a7 pawn turns into a target of attack. The black rook cannot move away from a8, it is tied to the defense of this pawn. Rubinstein develops the queen, and now you can pause the video and try to find Reti's brilliant move. This move at first sight looks a little bit unnatural, however it's a really sophisticated move. So you can pause the video and try to find how Reti increased the pressure on his opponent's position. He moves his queen right to the corner of the board. At first sight, the queen is passively placed in the corner. However, by playing queen a1, Reti creates two batteries, the queen and rook battery, increasing the pressure on a7, and the queen and the bishop battery. Now this pressure on the long diagonal is really annoying. So Rubinstein wants to decrease this pressure on the diagonal, so he plays knight e8, which leads to the exchange of the dark squared bishops. After bishop takes g7, knight takes g7. And of course now it would be a terrible blunder for white to capture on a7, because after rook takes a7, queen takes a7, black would play rook a8 and the white queen would get trapped. Of course Reti didn't make this mistake, he didn't capture on a7, instead he finishes his development. Only now he castles, and now he is ready to bring his second rook into play. The rook is going to move to b1, increasing the pressure on black's queenside. The knight is passively placed on g7, so Rubinstein activates his knight, knight e6 and rook b1 of course. And now that the rook is targeting b6, white is threatening to capture on a7. Because after rook takes a7, queen takes a7 and rook a8, the white queen on a7 wouldn't be trapped anymore, as she would be able to capture on b6 after that. So black must defend his a7 pawn. That's why Rubinstein plays bishop c6, opening the queen's way and defending the pawn. And only now, after developing all his pieces, after the pressure on black's position has reached its maximum, Reti pushes the pawn, the central pawn, to d4, creating an immediate threat of d5 with a fork. That's why bishop e4. Attacking the rook, so rook d1. Of course, now it would be a terrible blunder to capture on c4 because of knight d2 with a fork, winning a piece, of course. Rubinstein, of course, didn't do it. Instead, as the pressure on the a7 pawn is really annoying, as both the black rook and the black queen are tied to the defense of this pawn, Rubinstein pushes the pawn forward. Now the a pawn is defended by the b pawn and the queen and the rook are free to move. Besides that, the a pawn is actually a passed pawn and it might move forward later in the game. However, the a5 advance has a serious drawback. On a7, the black pawn was defending b6, And now that the pawn has moved to a5, now the b6 pawn becomes weak and it turns into a target of attack. But first, Reti pushes the pawn forward, attacking the knight, kicking it out of e6. At first sight, this d5 advance might look a little bit dubious, because it permanently weakens the c5 square and the black knight gets a great blockading square. However, in return, white gets a chance to reroute his knight via d4 to c6, and on c6 the white knight will be even stronger than the black c5 knight. Besides that, white will put a lot of pressure on the b6 pawn with his major pieces, after which the black knight will be forced to retreat to d7 in order to defend this pawn, while the white knight will remain on c6. So, knight d4. The knight is ready to jump on c6. Besides that, now the light-squared bishops are exchanged, and the black bishop controls the b1 square, preventing the possible rook b1. Now this bishop will be exchanged. So bishop takes g2, king takes g2. In the anticipation of knight c6, after which black won't be able to play rook d8 anymore, Rubinstein plays rook d8 right away. And after knight c6, the rook is under attack, but rook d6. Now both white pawns are blockaded. But Reti increases the pressure. He plays rook e3, threatening to capture on e7. So now probably it would be better for black, as Marozzi recommended, to sacrifice the exchange, because the knight is white's strongest piece and it paralyzes black's position. So probably it would be better to sacrifice the exchange in order to eliminate this terrible knight. And after d takes c, queen takes c6 check and f3, of course white has a slight advantage, he's up the exchange, but for the exchange black has a pawn and a great blockading knight on c5. And at least black has some activity. But Rubinstein didn't do it, he didn't sacrifice the exchange. Instead, as his e7 pawn is under attack, he defends it by playing rook e8. And we have reached a very important moment of the game. So, this knight completely paralyzes black's position. So black doesn't have any active counter play. And the only way of getting the counterplay is getting rid of this knight. And the only way of doing that is to undermine the defender of this knight, the d5 pawn. And to do it, black must prepare e6. And if black manages to play e6, followed by e takes d, c takes d, after which the d5 pawn will be weak, and of course black major pieces can attack this pawn, and if the d5 pawn falls, the c6 knight will also fall. And in order to prevent the possible preparations of e6, Reti makes another subtle move. He plays queen e5, attacking e7 for the third time, threatening knight takes e7 check. And it turns out that black cannot defend this pawn by playing rook d7. In this case, knight takes e7 check would follow, and after rook takes e7, queen takes e7, rook takes e7, d6 would fork the rooks, and after rook takes e3, d takes c, white is threatening to promote, black must play rook e8, but rook d8 would follow and white is winning. So after Reti's great move queen e5, as rook d7 doesn't defend the pawn, the only move for black to defend his e7 pawn is f6, in order to kick the queen out of e5. However, now we can see Reti's idea. The queen retreats, and it turns out that now that the black pawn isn't on f7 anymore, it will not support the advance of the e-pawn, so black won't be able to play e6 anymore later in the game, because both his e6 pawn and his f6 pawn will be weak and they will fall. So as e6 will not work, Rubinstein, at least as his e7 pawn is backward, he plays e5, so that the pawn is now protected by the f pawn. But that means the c6 knight will remain on this great square. And Reti plays queen b5. reinforcing the knight and preventing the possible liberating exchange sacrifice. Now black will not get a chance to sacrifice the exchange anymore on c6. So black is now passive. Only thing he can do is just making waiting moves. So he plays king f7. And now it's time to increase the pressure on black's main weakness, on b6. So rook b1, threatening to capture this pawn. And the great knight is forced to retreat from its great blockading square. So knight d7 in order to defend the pawn. Reti isn't in a hurry. He plays f3, taking the e4 square under control. Of course, black would love to exchange his passive knight for white's great knight by playing knight b8, but unfortunately for Rubinstein it doesn't work, because after knight takes b8, rook takes b8, white has a strong move c5, attacking the rook. Of course, the pawn is untouchable. Black cannot capture with the pawn because he would lose the rook, neither can he capture with the queen. For the same reason, he is losing the rook after that. For this reason, after c5, black must capture on d5, but after queen b3, the pin would prove to be deadly. After possible queen takes c5, black can defend the rook, but rook d3, attacking the rook for the second time, rook d8, defending it, rook d1, attacking for the third time, king e6, defending it, and e4, attacking the pinned rook with a pawn, and white is winning the rook. So, as knight b8 doesn't work, Rubinstein plays rook c8. Now another subtle move by Reti follows. He plays rook d3, defending the pawn and preventing the possible knight b8 once and for all. Now that the d5 pawn is defended, after possible knight b8 and exchanges of the knights and c5, black won't be able to capture the pawn anymore. So what to do? Black is completely squeezed, and this knight, the white knight, completely paralyzes him, and knight b8 doesn't work. But Rubinstein finds a very interesting opportunity. He plays e4, sacrificing a pawn in order to vacate the e5 square for his knight and finally get rid of this annoying white knight. Reti accepts the sacrifice and knight e5, not only targeting the knight, but also attacking the rook. But Reti makes another great move. He ignores the attack on his rook and captures on b6. And it turns out that if black captures the rook, of course he would be up the exchange, but after e takes d, it turns out that his position is completely hopeless. White already has 2 pawns for the exchange, which is sufficient compensation. Besides that, the a5 pawn will also fall as it's weak, so white will be up in material. Besides that, his knight has survived and his pawns will move forward. So white, of course, is winning. So after queen takes b6, instead of capturing the rook, Rubinstein finally eliminates this knight. And probably he expected natural d takes c, after which he would have simply captured on c6, and although white is up a pawn, his pawns are weak, isolated, doubled. The black major pieces are very active now, c4 will fall, and the position would be absolutely equal. But instead of capturing the knight, Reti prepared a very strong, a crushing in-between move. Before capturing the knight, he plays c5, kicking out the rook from d6. The rook must retreat, and only now he captures the knight. Opening the d-file, the rook is under attack. Black cannot capture on c6 because of queen takes c6, rook takes c6, and rook takes d7. Check, white is winning a rook. So black cannot capture on c6, he must capture on d3. At the moment, the pawns are weak, isolated, and doubled, but of course, first Reti exchanges the queens and then captures on d3, and again his pawns are connected. and they will defend each other. Black captures on c6, attacking c5, but d4. Of course, not right away. d4 right away was also possible, but Reti first gives a check, and after king e8, he plays d4. So, in the opening, on the first move, Reti didn't play e4, neither did he play d4, but in the endgame, in the rook endgame, both of his central pawns are placed on these ideal squares. Rubinstein tries his last chance. He has a passed pawn on the a file, so he plays rook a6 to support the advance of his passed pawn. But another strong move by Reti follows, rook b6, attacking both the rook and the pawn. Black cannot exchange the rooks because after c takes b, the pawn is ready to promote. Black doesn't have time to push his pawn, he must stop the b pawn, but the e pawn would move forward and one of white pawns will promote faster than the black pawn. For example, after a4, e6 check, king takes, b7, white is winning. So after rook b6, as rook takes b6 doesn't work, black must retreat his rook. But now Reti wins another pawn. a4, rook f2, a3, rook a2. The pawn is stopped. King d7, d5, g5, king f3, rook a4, trying to cut the white king on the fourth rank, so that the king can neither move to d4 nor to f4 because of the g pawn, but after king e3, h5, Reti makes another strong move, h4, in order to deflect the black pawn from g5, and after that his king can invade f4 and white is winning. In this position, Rubinstein resigned. And now I recommend watching one of the most spectacular victories by Reti, where he employs his opening and wins a brilliancy prize. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.